Well, it's Thursday, and sometimes you get these moments where you just feel inspired to do something. And in the past few weeks, I've felt inspired to read history with the canceling of in school classes at the academy here. I've had a little bit more time, so I thought I would take advantage to read on the Franciscan Spanish missions in the southwestern United States. I have no idea why I wanted to study or read about that particular religious order and period of history. I've had people ask me why, and I don't know. I just did. So I did. And I read a bunch of books. So, short books, don't worry. So I'm going to give a little talk just about some observations I discovered about the Franciscan missions. I think looking at the Franciscan missions, and I'm thinking specifically the Franciscan missions in the United States, I think that makes a lot of sense for us as Americans because, of course, the majority of the missions of the Spaniards in New Spain, when it was New Spain, were Franciscans. They were the first missionaries to arrive. There was a Franciscan with Christopher Columbus. There was a Franciscan with Coronado. All the first people to come to the Americas were typically accompanied by Franciscans. Later, very soon, of course, the Dominicans would come. And then eventually, once they began to exist in the 1540s, the Jesuits would come. And I think if you have seen the movie The Mission, that is a portrayal of a Jesuit mission to the, I'm going to mispronounce this, the Guarani in what is now Paraguay. So that gives you an idea of what we mean by a mission. The Jesuits, of course, the Jesuits being Jesuits, kind of perfected that. There's a whole history there, very different from, in some ways, from what happened in the United States. But I want to focus on Franciscans in America, in particular in the Southwest. I'm not going to mention the Franciscans in Florida. They even went as far as, I've been told, Massachusetts, although I'm not sure if that's true. Definitely Georgia, before the English Protestants got mad and chased them back to Florida. So, but I think if we want to look at the missions, it's really interesting because these men were so on fire for the gospel. And to understand the Spanish missionary work in the Americas, you have to understand as well a little bit the history of Reconquista in Spain that lasted more or less from 700 to 1500, more or less. That is the Spaniards more or less kicking out the Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula. Now, this period of evangelization of the Americas came very shortly after that, almost exactly right after that. So that's definitely in the minds of the men who will come to the Americas. When I read books about the Spanish missionaries, like a lot of things that involve the Catholic Church, there were lots of books saying how bad the missionaries were and how cruel they were to the Indians, and lots of books on that side. They did everything wrong. They were bad. They enslaved them. And on the other side, you have some Catholic works that say that they were perfect and everything was great and the Indians were always perfectly happy and nothing bad ever happened. And then you find some middle ground books, typically Catholic ones, which gave maybe a little bit more of a balanced view. But definitely for sure, and the thing that's important for us is that these men intended to bring the faith to these people, and they did it. And that's the fantastic thing that we want to focus on. I'm going to admit I have notes. I'm reading from notes. I'm going to be looking down at my notes. I'm not going to pretend like I'm just speaking ex abundancia cordis. I'm not. I'm human. I need notes. I'm reading notes. Full disclosure. Okay. Got that out of the way. When we talk about the missions were organized into what is normally called reductions. There's other names for it. reduction is simply a gathering of the native peoples, of the Indians, into a community that was very similar to a Spanish village at the time. So the idea is that they wanted to gather the Indians together to teach them how to farm, to teach them, of course, the faith. But essentially, they gave them all of the, not just the spiritual, but also all of the material aspects of Christendom. They wanted to form them and their children in this way of life. That, of course, is going to be the biggest criticism from those on the left, is that they eliminated their previous culture, their pagan culture, and replaced it with a Christian culture. This is a YouTube video by a Catholic priest. Obviously, we don't have too much of a problem with that. Anyway, yeah, of course. But anyway, so they were organized into reductions, these gatherings of the Indians into communities. They were taught catechism, especially. They were, of course, baptized. They were taught all these different crafts and farming, and they were essentially changed from their nomadic lifestyle to this organization as a stable people. The day was organized very much like a monastery. They had times of prayer in the morning. They had mass. They did all of these things together. I remember reading in one of the Jesuit missions, they would actually get a statue and lead the Indians out after prayers and breakfast out into the fields, and they would break off into the different fields and different places of work with the father, the padre, with the statue of a saint, and they would go out, or maybe it's Our Lady, but they'd go out until everyone is distributed to the various places, and then the priests and the servers would come back with the statue. It was very organized. It was really like a religious community. We have to remember that these missionaries, were religious. They were monks. They were not secular priests. They were Franciscans. That's something I'm going to talk about in maybe a little more detail towards the end of this video, though. It's unfortunate that many of the Indians did die due to illness, more than half. And that presented an extra challenge for the missionaries, because when the Indians, or the Franciscans themselves, died of disease, but especially with the Indians, they would have to find other Indians to bring into the mission to just continue the work of the mission. They build all these buildings, you plow all these fields, the work has to be done. And of course, the primary reason is to save souls. And these men, their first primary intention is to snatch these souls from the fires of hell. And like I said, that is really the most interesting thing for us. Another point, kind of preliminary point, just kind of setting the stage here. These men worked very closely with the Spanish crown. Maybe we have this idea that the missionaries just kind of went out into the wilderness on their own with the approval of the church, and they just evangelized everyone. That's not really accurate. These missionaries were sent with the approval of and with the protection of the Spanish crown. And so it would be normal that the missionaries would be accompanied by soldiers to protect them. There's the reality that they were, of course, in danger, especially if you're approaching a people who've never had contact with white Europeans. It could get violent. Even as the missions begin to develop, they need protection. They have to be realistic. And I'm thinking, once again, we're talking specifically of the missions in what is now the United States. I'm not speaking so much of the missions, the first missions in what is now Mexico. That's a whole other very interesting history. But for our intents and purposes, like I said, we're just focusing on the missions in the United States, or what's now the United States. So those missions, of course, came later. The Spanish Empire expanded from more or less from central Mexico, from Mexico City, up towards what is now New Mexico. It was also called New Mexico at the time, or anyway. I'm probably going to say all kinds of things that are historically not quite accurate, because I'm not an historian at all. So if you're an actual historian, feel free to somehow contact me and tell me how wrong I am. I actually would actually appreciate that. So I know I have notes, but I'm not perfect, so sorry. Okay. But anyway, so New Mexico, going up to that area, even Texas, their missions in Texas. And then, as we know, the missions in California. Those are very popular, especially because of Junipero Serra, who was canonized actually in 2015. So he's very popular. Most people have heard of him. So the missions in the United States, what is now the United States, by the time you get to that point, 18th century, so we're thinking especially 18th, 19th, early 19th century, the Franciscans coming to and forming the missions at that time. Remember that Spaniards and Franciscans had been in the Americas since the 1500s. So already hundreds of years of experience had happened with these missionaries. And they were formed in special colleges, formed with the particular purpose of forming Franciscans into missionaries. Another thing that's important too is to remember that these Franciscans weren't just any Franciscans. If you know a little bit of history of the Franciscan order, even from the very beginning, the time of St. Francis, there was controversy about how to interpret the rule that St. Francis made for his friars. And that's where you get the division between the conventual Franciscans, the observant Franciscans, the Capuchin Franciscans. Basically different ways of interpreting how to, really in regards to poverty, whether conventional Franciscans will say that the community can own property, while Capuchins or observant and also observant Franciscans, two different branches, would say no, you can't even communally own property. So much more strict interpretation. So these Franciscans were observant Franciscans. So these were really hardcore Franciscans. These weren't just any old Franciscans. They also wore gray habits, which I think is interesting. We normally think of them in brown habits. They actually wore gray. So they were sent from these colleges, as I said. They had colleges in Mexico City, some other places that are hard to pronounce. I'm not even going to try. In the Americas, many of these men came actually from Spain itself, not necessarily from Mexico, although certainly there were men who were born and raised in the Americas who became missionaries, of course, many of them. But especially towards the end, believe it or not, there was quite a number, I would even say a majority, came from Spain itself, came over the ocean, were trained in these colleges, and then sent to the missions. So, like I said, we have in New Mexico, what is now New Mexico, the Pueblo people who were evangelized by the missionaries. If you know a little bit of the history there, you may have heard as well of the Pueblo Revolt. One of the interesting things is just how difficult it was for these missionaries to do their job. If we think of it in a too idealistic way, we'll think of, they just came and formed these missions and they had these happy communities and then everyone was fine and then they became, whatever, Spanish towns or whatever. It was never that simple. Never that simple. It was a constant back and forth depending on, whether the Spanish crown could support the mission. Sometimes they'd have to withdraw, then they go back. Sometimes the Indians would revolt, or sometimes they would just run away. They would just go back to their nomadic lifestyle. They would sometimes attack the missions once they left, or just steal horses, or even attack the missionaries. There was a lot of trials. The Pueblo Revolt is the Pueblo people revolting against the missionaries. That happened. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail, but just that's kind of an important thing that happened in New Mexico. That was in 1680. Afterwards, of course, the Spanish reclaimed that territory and came back to the missions. And then you have the missions in Texas, which were more really just a reaction to the incursion of the French. Those nasty French came to Louisiana, and the Spaniards were scared that the French were going to come in and take all of their land. So that was even more impetus to expand the already existing, yet smaller missions in what is now Texas. And that, once again, that's after sort of the end of the 17th century. One of the most famous missions was in San Antonio. It's still there. It is more popularly known to Americans as El Alamo, the Alamo. that was, of course, a sort of mission fortress that was eventually became what it's known for today, an important part of Texan and American history. But that was a mission, a real mission, of course. And then, most popularly, the California missions. Junipero Serra he began missionary work in Mexico. He was eventually appointed to Baja California, so that's sort of like the continuation of the skinny part of California past the border in what's now Mexico, Baja California. And then eventually Alta California, which is California as we know it today in the United States. He founded most of those missions. And this was especially important after the Jesuits were suppressed in 1767, I believe. And that of course, left a big vacuum. And the Franciscans then, and Dominicans and other orders, had to fill that vacuum. And so that's a big part of it as well. Myself being from Arizona, there was a mission in Arizona that was run by the Jesuits. They were suppressed. The Franciscans had to take over. That happened in many places. So one of the really interesting things is, of course, and one reason to talk about this is that the mission still exists today, or at least very accurate replicas of the missions in their original locations, or places you can just go visit. So when you do get the chance to actually get out of your house one day, you can go to these missions, and they're really fascinating. There is in some of them a lot of original architecture. Many of them were destroyed for various reasons, but at the very least, you can see very accurate replicas. You really get a feel for what these places were. These are really the first seeds of the Catholic faith in our country before any Americans, as we understand them, came. So that I think makes it more interesting, and that's why I really encourage you, if you can, go to see those missions. There are missions in Texas, in New Mexico, in Florida, in Arizona, especially in California. The California mission is very popular. Go and see those. And those aren't even the only missions. There are other places as well, even if the buildings aren't there anymore. Like I was saying earlier in the video, these Franciscan missionaries, they were really they were hardcore. These guys were not wimps. Certainly, to live in the climate and with the hostility that they had to face, you had to be very tough. And so when they picked these men, appointing them to these special missionary colleges, they made sure to pick men who were known for their devotion, to their zeal, their prudence. They picked the cream of the crop to go out into these mission territories. And these men, they were Franciscans, and so they were not, going to these missions and, losing all of their Franciscan character. They continued as much as they possibly could to live their Franciscan life. That includes the life of the prayer, all the divine office, mental prayer, contemplation, recollection, of course, the spirit of poverty. Obviously, certain exceptions had to be made because, of course, they were dealing with lots of money and livestock and things like that. But these men really, especially at the very beginning, when the Franciscans first came to Mexico, that was their focus. Is we're going to evangelize people, and we're just going to continue just to be Franciscans, and we're not going to make exceptions. Later on, they had to kind of face the reality that to really expand the missions, they would have to make some certain exceptions. But for the most part, they understood this idea of prayer has to come first, prayer and penance. These were rigorous men. They were not wimps. And so that I think it's really edifying. You read their life and some of the things that they went through. Already just the hardships of the weather and all these other things, and yet they're still very penitential, very prayerful. It's really encouraging for those of us who really exercise an apostolate. They're a great example for us. They were really, really impressive. And like I said, their first intention, their first goal, more than anything else, even if they were working for the Spanish crown, who obviously wanted to expand their territory in the New World. Even if we can talk about certain mistakes that they made, even certain abuses that happened, even if life wasn't always easy for the Indians, certain misunderstandings, in the end, these men, first and foremost, wanted the salvation of these souls, and they were absolutely genuine in that intention. To accuse them of anything else, I think, would be really misunderstanding who these men really were. The original, the primary sources here do not indicate anything otherwise. These were holy men. So, what can we learn from our Franciscan missionaries? As I said, they struggled a lot. They faced many setbacks. The Spanish authorities didn't always cooperate with them. Sometimes they would have to withdraw them from the missions. Sometimes, if we go even to a different order, the Jesuits were suppressed. They had to all leave. I can imagine the immense sacrifice there that they had to make. The Indians revolting or running away. Or even many of the Indians weren't necessarily sincere in their conversions. There were some of the Indians who would go right back to their pagan ways or would take on some Christian practices, but not all of them. Or they would have Christian practices and mix them with their pagan practices. It would take a very long time before that could really be eradicated. And in some cases, actually, it never was. One of the issues there, of course, is that there just weren't enough missionaries for the many thousands and thousands of Indians that came to them. They were definitely outnumbered. And, for priests who have to exercise an apostolate around lots of people and give them the sacraments and preach and all these different things, that's becoming more and more of a reality today. There's fewer and fewer priests. It can be encouraging to see that, these Franciscan missionaries, no matter these setbacks, no matter these difficulties, they just kept persevering. They stuck to their rule. They stuck to their life of prayer. They stuck to their life of rigor. They never ceased to be religious in the proper sense of the term. They weren't all perfect, right? Many of them made mistakes. But nonetheless, these were men who knew what they wanted. They wanted the salvation of souls, and they persevered no matter what the difficulties were. And so when we get discouraged, maybe sometimes, maybe we would like to see, we want to see Christendom reestablished in the world. We want to see that happen again in our communities. We want this immediate result. And the Franciscans, any of these religious orders that came to the Americas for the first time, there may have been moments of big conversions, baptizing thousands, but for most of that history, it was just a question of just this constant difficulty, this constant battle, constant setbacks, and yet they never gave up. They persevered until they were forced to leave by the later Mexican authorities who wanted to secularize the missions. You may have heard of Juan de Padilla. He's famous in Kansas because he was the first Franciscan to shed his blood in what is today Kansas. He accompanied Coronado in his explorations of the Southwest. And after going with Coronado through all the Midwest, they were looking for cities of gold and whatnot. He went back to what is now Kansas in order to evangelize the Indians there. And from what I read, he wanted to form a mission, and he intended to form a mission among the Indians and to establish something there. This is already in the 16th century. But unfortunately, and this is, the communication problem is a big difficulty. He went to go visit another tribe. And that other tribe was an enemy of the tribe he was currently with, trying to form a mission. And of course, the former Indians were not happy about that. And so they thought he was a traitor or something similar to that. They killed him. He shed his blood. And I think, well, that's, it's beautiful. Kind of sad, though. He had this opportunity to really plant the faith so far away from sort of the center of the Spanish Empire. Yet it all came to nothing. And we might think, well, it's a failure. But we have that expression, the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. And we might not see those graces that are planted today in the here and now, but the graces of God, really, in a way, they transcend time. And so the efforts that we make now, the sacrifices that we make now, they will bear fruit, but we may not necessarily see that fruit today. We may not necessarily see the good results now. We might have to wait many, many years, many, many centuries before we can really see the fruit of our work. Now, there's no doubt these men, like Juan de Padilla, they were planting seeds. And I think we, in our hostile world, in our very secularized world, we need to just keep planting seeds and not give up and not be discouraged. No matter what obstacles are thrown our way, just keep living the faith. Keep doing good for souls. Keep doing what we can. My last video was about being a missionary. These are some actual missionaries. And hopefully we can acquire their spirit, their fervor, their enthusiasm, which, remember, was rooted first in their own sanctification, their own life of prayer and penance, and then, of course, focused all on the salvation of souls, snatching souls from the fires of hell. They had really very pure intentions. And so let's read our history, and like the Franciscans, learn from them, learn from the Franciscans, and soldier on in our faith and not be discouraged. So thank you for listening.